everybody. Thanks for coming. So we're going to get going now with our talks. I'd like to introduce John from Therapy Gardens. He's going to be giving us a talk all about coffee and pretty much everything you could possibly imagine about coffee. So let's give a warm welcome to John.
Thank you for that. I recognize some of you from the times that I've been here before. Hello to you. And for the folks that I haven't met before and who haven't been to one of these presentations by Therapy Gardens, does everybody know the Therapy Gardens story or no? No. Okay, so I should probably share that first. The gentleman who started Therapy Gardens was originally a high school principal, and after doing that, he started this business a couple of years ago, and his main objective initially was to try and bring therapeutic benefits of gardening to seniors in Massachusetts. So we were, at the start, bringing around elevated garden beds and soil and trying to encourage that at senior centers. And what we discovered was a lot of senior centers either already had a program, most of which were little used, or weren't nearly as interested in that as they were in the workshops that we started to give on gardening subjects. So we started to do workshops on stuff like preserve your garden, harvest, make your own herb garden, things related to gardening. And people loved the workshop format. It was really popular, so that just took off and really was the birth of the business. And from there, we expanded pretty rapidly, so now we're in, I think it's 94 is the latest count, cities and towns in Massachusetts. We try to stay in central and eastern Mass, but occasionally one of the towns out west pulls us out there. And the subject matter has run well beyond gardening. So now we do subjects as diverse as artificial intelligence. We have one on UFOs. And the UFO one, by the way, when I first heard that, I was scratching my head, despite the current news. But it's one of our most popular. People absolutely love it. And we also have, we do health and wellness stuff like about diabetic cooking. But some of our most popular, too, are things that are just fun. We have trivia workshops. We have one that's local food trivia that people really seem to like, where we talk about stories in Massachusetts, everything from Howard Johnson's to the chocolate chip cookie and all this other stuff, and it's really participatory. People seem to like that, and that change gave birth to Senior U. That's a second brand that we have besides Therapy Gardens. That speaks to the fact that a lot of the stuff that we do now isn't specifically about gardening. So if you look online, you'll see at therapygardens.com, you'll be able to see our presence, and there's also another website, seniorU.com, as well. And if you do have any interest in this presentation, at the end of the presentation, when you go home, you can get on therapygardens.com and you can request a copy of the presentation, and we'll send it to you. You could also, if you have any questions, and feel free to ask questions throughout, or share your own coffee experiences. I'll try to prod you for a few, but if you have something to share, go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll be happy to include it. The other thing to mention about the Therapy Gardens website is that we have a newsletter that we send out on a monthly basis that we're pretty proud of. A fair amount of effort goes into it, and just so you know, we encourage people to sign up for that, but we know that folks are wary about sharing their email addresses these days. And the example that I give is I went to a dry cleaner for the first time in maybe 10 years, 6 months ago, and I needed a shirt pressed. And I went in, and the gentleman behind the counter first asked me for my email address, and I said, why would I give you my email address? I just want a shirt pressed. And then he asked for a phone number, and before I thought about it, I gave him my phone number. And when I came out and I was driving down the street, and I got 2 strange texts within like 10 minutes of leaving the dry cleaner. So we share those stories ourselves, and it's wholly to us to protect your data. So if you end up signing up for the newsletter, rest assured that we don't share your information with anybody. So that's a little bit about Therapy Gardens and Senior U, the company behind this. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. Coffee. Here we go. Coffee talk, appreciating and learning about coffee. That's the Senior U brand that I mentioned. Here we have an Abraham Lincoln quote. If this is coffee, please bring me some tea, but if this is tea, please bring me some coffee. So I'm not sure, I guess you could interpret that quote in a number of different ways. Maybe part of it speaks to the fact that the quality of the beverage was probably much diminished from what we enjoy today, back then. But there you go. So a little warm up. Brazil is the largest coffee producer. So Brazil produces a third of the coffee in the world. It's hugely dominant in terms of the production of coffee. The second statement, the only American state that grows coffee is Hawaii. We left that on there, but that's not totally true at this point. And are people familiar with Hawaiian coffee? You've probably heard of Kona coffee and stuff like that.
Yeah, very good.
Does anybody have a particular taste for that?
I like it.
For the Kona coffee, okay. But because of developments now, there are other states that are trying to grow coffee, and we'll see something on the next slide about that. Famous coffee lovers. So we're thinking of people in history who loved coffee. There was a guy named Balzac. Are people familiar with the French novelist Balzac, who was one of the most productive writers in history? And he was famous for, he would go to bed really early and wake up at midnight and then write for hours and hours and hours. And the way that he did this was he allegedly drank 50 cups of coffee a day or a morning and night as he was writing. So he was famous for that. Staying with the bees, Beethoven. Beethoven was, you might think of him as somebody who's pretty particular, at least I do, and he was at least as particular about his coffee. So he insisted that 50 beans be used to make the cup of coffee. And there were stories, I don't know if they're apocryphal or not, but that he could taste if somebody added or subtracted the bean and he wasn't happy. So he doesn't sound like, might not have been a lot of fun to work for Beethoven. Bach had he actually wrote an opera about his daughter. He was afraid that she would not, and this is what the opera was about, the character in the opera, that she was a coffee addict, and he was afraid that she would not be married successfully because of this habit. So the opera is the tragedy of being addicted to coffee. Some other coffee lovers from history, Teddy Roosevelt supposedly drank a gallon of coffee per day and had 5 lumps of sugar in each of his cups of coffee. But I guess it doesn't really boil down to the number of cups you would anticipate coming out of a gallon, because he drank them in what would be, I guess, considered bowls today. So it might have only been 3 cups where he got his gallon. Nepal, India, and Pakistan drink the least coffee. And can anybody tell me why that is? Why do you think they would drink the least coffee in Nepal, India, and Pakistan?
Yeah, they want tea.
Tea, right, exactly. Tea, because they're big on the tea. Let's see here. The future. So as I said, we're going to contradict what was in the first slide about American coffee growing being exclusive to Hawaii. This is a picture at the University of Florida and the USDA, a collaboration to see if they can grow coffee there. And there is some benefit. I mean, coffee grows best in the shade, not in the direct sunlight. So the citrus groves in Florida provide a great opportunity because they've got established irrigation systems and they've also got the shade of the citrus plant. So that's one place where they're they're trying to grow it, and when you talk about the future, the other thing to mention is because of technology, obviously, indoor agriculture and the possibilities for cultivating it indoors in the long run. What country drinks the most coffee? What country drinks the most coffee? Any guesses?
US.
Not France, not, oh, and this is per capita, this isn't total, because I think in terms of total consumption, yeah, it would be the US, but in terms of per capita, and you want to think, I mean, what are the reasons why coffee might be more popular in one culture than another? And this is really basic fundamental stuff in some ways. I'll give you a clue, the places that are darkest and coldest might end up having the more popular.
This is a hot beverages.
So there we go.
Yeah.
Finland right at the top of the list, followed by Norway, Iceland, and Denmark. Some-
You have to have stuff to keep you awake during those long, dark winters.
Yes, exactly. There you go. Fast facts. Coffee beans come from the bush-like coffee plant. The beans are the pips inside the coffee cherry. Technically, they're berries. And it can take 5 years for a coffee plant to bear fruit, 10 years for commercial production. So I read that the most productive years are 5 to 10 to 20 years old for a coffee plant, but a coffee plant will live for 100 years. General lifespan is about 30 to 40 years, but that's for commercial purposes. If you just have a plant, the plant will live for a century. And where coffee is grown can affect the taste. Varieties. This was something that surprised me as well, that there are over 120 varieties of coffee plants. Far more than lead to commercially available kinds of coffee. Most of the coffee we consume comes from two plants, the Arabica, more expensive, tastes sweeter, more robust, and Robusta, lower acidity, less sweet, popular for espressos. So there's evidently fat and sugars in coffee, and the Robusta coffee has about half as many sugars as there is in the Arabica coffee. So some people think that the Robusta is, some people say it tastes like burnt rubber. It's not something that appeals to a lot of folks. Now, for the coffee aficionados in the room, does anybody favor Robusta coffee? Do you know? Are people aware of which kind they're drinking necessarily?
No.
Probably not. So just about everybody that we can buy coffee from, you're going to get an Arabica bean and coffee. So if you get your coffee at, how many people make coffee at home? Make coffee at home. And for those of you that make coffee at home, what kind of coffee are you buying to make?
Pizza or Starbucks.
Pizza, Starbucks,
Dunkin' Donuts cups.
Dunkin' Donuts cups,
Trader
Green Mountain.
Joe's.
Green Mountain.
Green Mountain.
Dunkin' Donuts ground.
Oh, Dunkin' Donuts ground. Okay. I think all of those are Arabica beans across the board. It's a lot more popular in the United States. Decaffeinated coffee is a process, not a variety. Does anybody drink decaffeinated coffee?
Occasionally.
Okay. And for the decaffeinated coffee, what we gathered about the decaffeinated coffee was that there was a process that was used most of the time to take the caffeine out, which was a chemical wash, which wasn't necessarily, would leave a residue that wasn't great for you. And I think you can still run into that coffee, but since then, there's something called a Swiss method, and they use osmosis to extract the caffeine, and that's, you're gonna get better, it's gonna be better for you and taste better than if you're gonna use the old process. So if you like decaffeinated coffee, might be worth confirming that it is the Swiss method that's taking the caffeine out for you. A short history of coffee. Historically, coffee has been cultivated in equatorial regions. So in terms of where it's been cultivated, and I should mention, we might revisit this in some future slides, but we talked about the Arabica and the Robusta. The Arabica grows best at around 60 to 70 degrees, and it grows best around 6,000 feet. Whereas the Robusta is more sea level to 3,000 feet and 10 degrees north or south of the equator is where the Robusta happens. So climate issues over time might play into Robusta becoming more and more available to us and less Arabica, just for some of those reasons. Started in the Middle East in the 1400s and expanded to Northern Africa, India, South Asia, and the Americas. And we mentioned climate a cause for concern, no surprise, it is for everything. So here's the beginning. This is Kali. This is an Ethiopian goat herder. And the myth is that he found this plant and his goats were munching on the plant, on the berries. And then the goats got really excited and started to run around. So he tried it too, and he got a little excited and started to run around. So word of this magic plant got out, and what happened was across the Red Sea in Yemen, they began making coffee in the way that we do now in modern times. And it was used in rituals by Sufi monks. And I believe that's a Sufi monk there in the picture. And at that time, this is around the middle of the 15th century. So it's the middle of the 15th century, and now it's becoming popular and moving throughout the Muslim world. And that was the Ottoman Empire at the time. So it became really, really popular and moved throughout the Muslim world. Let's see. So, and you might, there's a port on the southern side of Yemen called Mocha, for example. So some of the old ways of approaching coffee are still with us. But what were we drinking? So in the Muslim world at that time, what's fascinating is that there were all sorts of developments and in science and culture that emerged from coffee spreading across the culture. So it's no coincidence, coffee's a social drink, and it really energizes the mind and it gets you thinking. It lifts you up in that way, and it had a distinct impact on the Ottoman Empire and in that part of the world. I mean, a lot of our modern technology can be traced back to mathematical discoveries and successes that came from that culture during those times, which is pretty interesting. So at the same time they're starting to drink coffee, what's being drunk in the Western world? You're getting up in the morning in 1500 or 1600 in Western Europe. What are you drinking? Anybody know? Probably alcohol.
I was gonna say,
Me.
Yeah. I mean, the water was usually questionable. You didn't want to make yourself sick, and any kind of a fermented beverage was going to be giving you at the advantage of staving off some kind of sickness. So, as this was happening, let's move to the next. So it's replacing the breakfast beer. And this guy's named Michael Pollan. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He at least a few people are. He just wrote a great book he writes books on all sorts of drugs, really. And he focused on coffee, saying it is indeed the most popular psychoactive drug in the world. And they estimate, I think it's at least a billion, it might be 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed by human beings every day across the world. It's hardly an exaggeration to say that the arrival of caffeine in Europe changed everything. Coffee and tea ushered in a shift in the mental weather, sharpening minds that had been fogged by alcohol, freeing people from the natural rhythms of the body and the sun, thus making possible new kinds of work and arguably new kinds of thought too. So around 1600, it started to push, coffee became popular in Italy. Italy is a crossroads of sorts, and people started drinking it. But the Catholic Church wasn't happy with that because it was known as a drink that was confined to this other culture. So they called it the devil's brew, saying it was satanic, and attributing all of this stuff to it to try and make sure it didn't influence Italy and the culture. But people loved it, so they really pushed, and then the Pope at the time, a Pope Clement VIII, he said, you know what, let me really look at this. And he allegedly tested coffee himself and then came back and said, you know what, this is good stuff. He gave it his seal of approval. So then it moved into Italy, and that was 1600. And from 1600, it moved pretty rapidly into the Western world and across Europe. And by 1650, for example, it was in New Amsterdam. Does anybody know what New Amsterdam is?
New York.
Right, New York City, when the Dutch colonists were there. And along the way, there are some great stories about, I guess Lloyd's was a coffee shop that sprung up in England, and the birth of the insurance industry is attributed to this. This was a place where people were involved with import-export near docks, and they say that coffee fueled that. So now it's come to the United States. We have a Thomas Jefferson quote, "The favorite drink of the civilized world, and tea is for traitors." And folks can probably tell me why this is the case, right? What famous historical event?
The Boston Tea Party.
The Boston Tea Party, exactly. Oh. Negatives. There are some elephants in the room where coffee is concerned, including child labor, destruction of rainforests. The good news is that there's a movement towards responsibly sourced coffee. The fair trade, you see the fair trade label on, it is kind of it's more of a prayer than something that's tracked closely, given how incredibly popular coffee is. There are farms large and small all across the world where they're grown, and in a lot of those cultures, the children live and work on the farm. But the fair trade, even the biggest companies in America are now all in on trying to reach towards fair trade. So you mentioned Dunkin' Donuts. I mean, for example, Dunkin' Donuts says by the end of next year, all of its coffee will be fair trade. So the health benefits and effects. Moderate coffee intake, 2 to 5 cups a day, which to me is not exactly moderate, that seems to be a fair amount of it, is linked to lower likelihood of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, liver and endometrial cancers, Parkinson's, and depression.
Is that caffeinated or decaf?
It's, I believe most of the studies are done with caffeinated coffee, but I'm not sure. That's a great question. But once you get into any health issue, and we run into this when looking at other things as well, it's really difficult to say any specific food has a certain effect on your health. We've sort of been trained to believe that easily by the television set and by folks trying to sell that product that is good for you. But given that most of us are not just sitting eating one thing, like none of us is doing that, it's really hard to tie them together. It's also true that to the extent that there are studies, and there have been many, those studies are almost always talking about people who drink upwards of 2 cups of coffee a day. So for instance, there's, if you just have a single cup of coffee a day, as I do, I don't know that you're necessarily going to get those health benefits, but by all accounts, it is good for your health. The personal story that I could share is my favorite grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and my sister, brother, and I swore that the only things we ever saw her put into her body were cookies, Chesterfield filterless cigarettes, and coffee. We never really saw her eat anything else or drink anything else. And she drank a ton of coffee. And she would, I lied because she actually would drink coffee soda. She would send my grandfather like 50 miles away to go buy coffee soda because you couldn't get it then, except in special spots. So she is despite that, and it wasn't like she exercised a lot. She exercised her mind a fair amount, but she wasn't really a physical person. But of my 4 grandparents, she lived the longest. So I don't know if that speaks to coffee benefits or her genes. I'm not sure, but. Adenosine. So adenosine is it's a biochemical that we begin to accumulate as soon as we wake up. It's the way that we get tired, for lack of a better word. So that accumulates the whole time we're awake, and by the time it reaches a certain amount, we get sleepy and we go to sleep. What caffeine does is jump on those same receptors, and it interrupts the adenosine for a period of time, and that's why we get the charge that we do. And here's a caffeine chart, and I'll read this to you because I think, because of our setup here, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it. So for a lot of people who are caffeine sensitive, and we talked earlier, a lot of us are caffeine sensitive at a certain point, or even at a given time of the day. It's important to know how much caffeine is in the drink that we have in front of us. So here at the top of our list here is a Starbucks drip coffee. And in the Starbucks drip coffee, there's 260 milligrams of caffeine. So and maybe that accounts in part for some of the popularity, or for the folks that like Starbucks coffee. It is significantly more caffeine filled than a lot of other drinks. Dunkin' Donuts, the same size coffee, a little less, 215. A 5-hour energy drink, 215 milligrams. The McDonald's coffee has half as much. So half as much caffeine in the McDonald's coffee. And I've gotten 2 different, I've explored, why? Some folks, and I don't have a definitive answer, but some folks have said that it's simply, they're trying to get more out of the coffee, so there's more water.
Right, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
That's why I don't like Starbucks coffee, because it's so strong.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, so it does make sense that it would have more caffeine.
Yes. A Red Bull, I always thought, I never did the Red Bull thing, but when I saw people with the Red Bulls, I was always figuring that was at least a cup of coffee worth of caffeine. But it's apparently not. It's only 80 milligrams of caffeine. And let's see, go down the list here.
It gives you wings.
There you go, wings are good. Black tea, 67, and a Coke only has, well, actually a regular Coke has 34. This is also what I didn't know, that a Diet Coke has considerably more caffeine than a Coke.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Considerably more, what is that? Maybe 30% more, nearly that.
Huh. That is interesting.
That's kind of interesting. So 10 healthy reasons to drink coffee. And the gentleman who I mentioned at the outset, Dave Wheeler, who started the company, he loves the AI. Aside of, dystopian views of its overall impact on our world, just using it to plan a dinner party or or to do all sorts of tasks related to whatever work you do or other things that you're trying to accomplish, it can be really handy. So he asked the AI to assemble this list, which it did. Number 1, boosts energy levels and productivity. 2, contains antioxidants that protect your cells from damage. 3, may lower the risk of several diseases, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and liver disease. Can reduce the risk of depression and improve mood. May help burn fat and increase metabolism. Contains essential nutrients, magnesium and potassium. May lower the risk of type 2 diabetes. And can improve physical performance during exercise. I've talked to a few people who say that, for whatever they do for exercise, strangely enough, even a couple of people that do yoga, which sounds, I would never think that those two go together, caffeine and yoga. But for a lot of folks, if you're doing something that's physical, caffeine could be, specifically coffee could be a help. Contains caffeine, which can help improve mental clarity and focus, and can be a social and enjoyable part of a daily routine. So we did the chocolate presentation, and I don't want to be a downer, but one of the considerations for chocolate now, as you might have read, are the heavy metals that are inside of some of the chocolates. Consumer Reports did a big test on chocolate, and they found levels above recommended of cadmium and lead, I think, in almost all the popularly sold chocolates, many of them anyway. So if you eat a lot of dark chocolate, you should eat it minimally. You shouldn't eat a whole bar at a time, is generally the idea. But those same concerns exist for a lot of different crops, but particularly also for coffee. So to mitigate that, the best ways to mitigate that are, one of the things is vitamin C. Vitamin C evidently helps extract heavy metals from the body. There are other heavy metals that we need, like copper, and I think it's magnesium. And if you're deficient in those, then you're going to be more likely to take up the heavy metals and other things. So, coffee chemistry. This is the Arabica versus the Robusta. So, as I mentioned, the altitude for the Arabica is grown at a higher altitude and at a lower temperature. And you can see the caffeine content of the Arabica beans is a little bit lower. And you guys are not going to be able to see this in terms of where the different stuff is grown. But Vietnam, for example, is the top producer of Robusta beans. Vietnam and Indonesia are real popular spots for the Robusta beans. And something else about the Robusta bean, it's actually a harder bean too. So it is less susceptible to predation from insects. So that's another reason where you would think commercially in an environment, physical environment that's challenged, they'll probably favor Robusta beans more in the future. I'm not going to go further into that. You guys can't see that. I can barely see that. Does anybody have questions, though, about Arabica and Robusta? Anything? No? Pausing for a breath from a tree. Everybody take a breath. So here are the beans. When we look at the beans, this is the way, this was news to me, this is the way most beans are shipped. So before they end up at a coffee roaster, and most of the people that produce coffee are going to receive as a shipment unroasted beans, which are actually green and soft. They're spongy before you roast them. And then they're showing what happens as you roast medium onto the darker kinds of roasts. So it depends on the roast. Here are the different types of roast. So the light roast with higher caffeine. Are people familiar with this? No? Okay. I mean, when I was growing up, I always assumed that dark coffee would have more caffeine. When I heard stronger, I didn't differentiate between taste and the psychoactive effect of the caffeine. But Mother Nature does. So the taste of a dark coffee may indeed be stronger, but the light coffee is where you're going to get the most bang in terms of the caffeine. So this is we have the temperature here that you're roasting it at, the caffeine content, the light has high caffeine, the medium, and the dark. So, and you get over here to the very dark. So if you really roast it for a real long time, it's not going to have much caffeine at all. You're actually roasting it long enough where you're going to make the beans more porous, and a lot more of the caffeine evidently is either evaporated or...
Is that how decaf is made?
I'm sorry?
Is that how decaf is made?
No.
Is that, okay. Oh, that's the chemical process you were talking about.
No. This is regular roasting for ordinary coffee, and you would have to do the same thing presumably with decaffeinated beans.
Okay.
You know. So here are some different ways to make coffee. And does anybody know what this is?
It's a Chemex, huh?
Right. It's a Chemex, or a pour over is what I call it. And for a long time, this was my favorite go-to way for a cup. Because I love the simplicity of it. What it doesn't show is the paper filter at the top. You have a paper filter, you put your ground coffee in there, and then you just have water that you pour over. And there, bingo, you have your cup of coffee. Something to mention for the pour over too, they recommend it's 195 to 205 is the ideal temperature for the water meeting the beans. So if you've just boiled water and you're using this process, you probably want to wait. It's about maybe 20 seconds for it to come off of the 220 or whatever it boils at. Does anybody use this method? No. Oh, you do? Okay. So we got one. How about, for those of you, a bunch of you raise your hands that you make it at home. How do you make it?
Automatic drip. Yeah, that's my
Automatic
French
drip.
press or K-cups?
Keurig.
French, the Keurig is really popular. Huh. I'm trying to think if
Well,
does anybody make espresso
No.
on occasion? Do you have a machine? And
Yeah, an espresso maker, but also when you put on the stove,
Oh, yeah.
like turban, is it? Yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. For the grinders in the room, so these are the folks that are, so how many folks grind their own beans?
occasionally.
Yeah, occasionally.
Okay, we've got a few that grind their own beans. These are the different kinds of grinds for the different devices that you're going to use to make it. So you want a coarse grind if you're using the French press or the cold brew, which is becoming more and more popular. A medium coarse, less chunky for the pour over, complete middle of the road for the drip coffee maker and the siphon, and then you're using much finer grind for the espresso and then the Turkish coffee pot. One of the stories that I'm thinking of that reminds me of is during the Civil War, the Union soldiers got 35 pounds of coffee allotment every year, and were known to absolutely revere and appreciate their coffee allotment. So you would think that would also kind of surprise me. 'Cause I would have thought it would have been, managed within their unit somehow. But no, each individual got that, and they were known to make their coffee out of puddle water if need be, because they were so interested in drinking it. And this was different from the Confederate soldiers who didn't have that. They drank a chicory root beverage, and the chicory root beverage is, it would probably offend the palate of most people who love coffee, but it's really good for controlling blood sugar and constipation, if anybody wants to try it. The other thing to mention historically that I read about recently was the Native Americans. The Native Americans there was a drink called a black drink, and it was either called that, Cassina, or Yaupan. And that was their version of coffee, and it was made from a species of holly plant that was indigenous to coastal areas going from Virginia down to Texas. And it was a real commodity in the pre-Columbian world here. It was traded on a regular, massive scale. Press out. So the press out is, that's the word for espresso. That's the translation of it, roughly. And we're seeing that here. The Italians still love it. It's a lot of Italian expatriates who popularized it in other places around the world. Or diaspora, I wouldn't say expatriates, I guess. But so a lot of that began in places like the North End, and Boston was a big place where it became popularized in the whole country. And Little Italy in Manhattan and North Beach out in California. And they drink it, it was interesting, they drink it oftentimes with a glass of water. So they'll take a glass of water and they'll drink the water first, because the water evidently cleans the palate and gets your mouth ready for the espresso. And now, of course, this is for the people that drink that like lattes or cappuccino, things that have mixes in them. All of those are espresso based. So it ends up being pretty popular here because of that. We always like to promote local businesses wherever we can. And for coffee, this one's in Bridgewater, Mike Shays. And he's got, it's a real unassuming place that it doesn't look like he intended to have a retail part of the operation. But there are a lot of these places now where their whole goal was just to buy beans and roast themselves and see what they could come up with for good coffee beans. And he's got all sorts of programs like huge discounts for first responders. And it's primarily a place where you go to buy beans, but there's a small area there where you could drink it. So for when you do go out to enjoy a cup of coffee someplace else, if you're not making it home, does anybody have a recommendation for a place to go?
Just the usual chains.
The usual chain?
Yeah.
Yeah. For the usual chain, my only usual chain story is my uncle, my mother's 88 and she has a brother who's 5 years younger, and they hadn't seen each other in maybe 6 or 7 years because of the pandemic and other things. So my uncle came up this summer, he lives in Philadelphia, with his wife to have dinner, and it was a big family event. So we all went, we got together, my uncle and his wife and a bunch of us, and after we sat down and talked for a while, he announced the real reason why he came up. And the real reason why he came up was he wanted to visit the original Dunkin' Donuts in Quincy. Which didn't go over great, but... and here's just finishing up here. Here are some old coffee advertisements from the past. And that is it. Thanks for attending, but before we leave, does anybody have anything to share or any questions? Yes.
So how is it that they're now making all these flavored coffees? You have your hazelnuts, and is that just something they add to the beans after they've roasted it, do you know, or? Because I know these flavored coffees are really popular. I don't necessarily drink them, but you see them in the grocery store or what have you.
Yes. Does anybody else, is anybody a flavored coffee person?
Yeah.
Okay. And for the ones that you have, are you talking about a syrup in the coffee?
No, I buy I like the French vanilla.
Oh,
So I'll buy the French vanilla ground coffee.
So, and that's what you're talking about?
That's what I'm talking about, yeah.
I mean, the ways to, I'm not sure what the process is, the flavorings. I met a gentleman once who was in the flavor business, and I wish I could remember something that was specifically about coffee that he was talking about. But what he was just talking about the leverage that it gave for selling stuff, because more and more, it's not just coffee; it's all sorts of things that we have now that have a little flavor in them from someplace else. So it's and I think there are, if you read the specifics, some of them are in fact natural, but then you can also produce flavors now synthetically with chemicals as well. Yeah.
My cousin's daughter-in-law lives out in western Massachusetts, and she bought a roaster. She has a company called Stout Pigeon Coffee Company. And she bought a horse trailer and converted that, and she goes around to different sites and does her coffee, or goes to, if there's a craft show or something, and she sets up and she sells coffee
Wow.
to drink or, roasted.
Where is she out of?
She's out in western Massachusetts. Turner's Falls.
It turns false. Oh, wow. And so she roasts the beans, and then she goes out and sells
She bought
cups.
a roaster, yeah.
And sells cups on certain days. They just know
Right.
she'll be there at a
Right.
certain time.
Yeah, she'll advertise in the area.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
It's like a food truck with coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really seems like, I mean, given its popularity, it's so broadly popular, there's so many, entrepreneurs that are standing up now and creating some version of a coffee business. Either they're doing roasting stuff or trying to set up a cafe. Other questions or comments, anything?
Well, that's the one I looked at, it was gone.
Yeah, there's a new one too, for a neighbor, she just.
Years ago, I was in the Dominican Republic with my ex-husband, and he had done his, what they call the acculturation training at the beginning of the Peace Corps volunteer stuff, kind of up in the foothills of the mountains in the Dominican Republic where they grow coffee. And it was very cooperative. Everybody in sort of a certain town or village would all go up into the hills and pick the coffee beans. So it was great to have when we visited, to have the opportunity to see that. And then they had these big concrete platforms out in the sun, so nothing was shading. And they take the berries and they dry them. And then they went to the next process. And these people worked. The middleman, of course, always makes the big money. But if you've ever had Dominican coffee, it is that real super dark roast, almost burnt smell. So depending on where you go, if you're in like San Domingo or another city, and you go by some place that's roasting the coffee, you can smell that burnt coffee smell of that real dark roast. But the coffee is so good, and they make it, they call it a sock. It's sort of like the old-fashioned Italian way. They have this, like a ring thing, or out in the what do you call the campo, out in the countryside, they would have this thing that looks sort of like a muslin sock, and they would put it over this container, and they put the coffee in there, they pour the water, and it would drip very slowly through the sock to make it, so not a lot of grounds got in your coffee, but it was very strong, but really good coffee.
Wow.
But dark, dark, dark.
Wow. And you point out, and you remind me too, that now that we have all these small individual roasters, and I mean, the old model lent itself much more to having roasting done
Right.
where they cultivate it, yeah. And I think, so for memorable, that's a great story, thank you for that. And for memorable cups of coffee, I had a cup of coffee in Thailand, which I think was the Robusta from Vietnam. And because it is, because it can be bitter, it has less sugars in it and stuff like that, you can't get it unless it has a ton of sugar in it.
Well, you know, it's interesting when you get Thai coffee at a Thai restaurant, it's always sweetened.
Yeah. I think that's because of the Robusta. I think.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's the way they like it. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.